Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has nothing left to lose except his dignity. Tom Reyes knew that feeling well when he spent his last $3,000 on a rusted Cold War submarine at a government auction. Everyone in Millfield Harbor laughed at him. The unemployed mechanic had bought 30 tons of scrap metal sitting in an abandoned shipyard. His neighbors called him crazy. His friends stopped talking to him. Even his own brother said he'd lost his mind. But Tom found something inside that submarine. Hidden chambers that weren't on any blueprint. Secret compartments welded shut for decades. And inside those compartments was a treasure worth $188 million. The problem was, some people would kill to keep that secret buried. But what would Tom do when he discovered the deadly truth behind his fortune? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled across Millfield Harbor like it had every day for the past 40 years, carrying the scent of salt and diesel fuel that Tom Reyes had grown up breathing. He stood at the window of his cramped apartment above Murphy's Diner, watching the sun struggle through the grey blanket that seemed to mirror his own life these days. The harbor below was quieter now than it had ever been. Half the fishing boats sat unused at their moorings, their owners having given up and moved inland for work. The other half belonged to men too stubborn or too old to start over somewhere else. Tom fell into the latter category, though at 47 he wasn't sure if stubborn or stupid better described his situation. His apartment was a testament to a life lived paycheck to paycheck. The furniture had come from yard sales and estate auctions over the years, a mismatched collection that somehow felt more like home than any showroom set ever could. The kitchen table where he ate his solitary meals was the same one his father had used in the garage workshop, its surface scarred by decades of tools and coffee cups. On the counter sat his father's toolbox, a massive red craftsman chest that held more sentimental value than monetary worth. Those tools had taught him everything he knew about fixing things that others had given up on. His father, Miguel Reyes, had been the kind of mechanic who could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it idle. He'd passed that intuition down to his son, along with the belief that nothing was ever truly broken, just misunderstood. "Everything has a purpose, Mijo," his father used to say, while Tom watched him work on the fishing boats down at the harbor. "Sometimes you just have to look deeper to find it." Tom had carried that philosophy through 25 years of working at Kellerman Shipyard, the massive industrial complex that had employed half the men in Millfield Harbor. He'd been the guy they called when a hydraulic system failed during a storm, when an engine seized up on a Saturday night, when something needed fixing that nobody else could figure out. His hands knew the difference between a bearing going bad and a belt slipping just by the vibration through a wrench handle. But even the best mechanics couldn't fix an economy that no longer needed their skills. The shipyard had closed 8 months ago, another casualty of overseas manufacturing and corporate cost-cutting. The official statement had mentioned restructuring and market conditions, but Tom knew the truth was simpler. It was cheaper to build ships in South Korea than in a small Massachusetts harbor town. 230 jobs had disappeared overnight, including his. He'd burned through his savings in the first 3 months, too proud to file for unemployment and too optimistic about finding new work. The fishing industry was dying along with everything else in Millfield Harbor. The few remaining boat owners did their own maintenance or hired kids willing to work for beer money. There wasn't much call for a master mechanic who specialized in industrial hydraulics and marine diesel engines. His unemployment benefits had run out 2 months ago. Last week, he'd sold his truck, a 1995 Ford F-150 that had been his father's before him, to cover another month's rent. The bus ride to the government surplus auction yesterday had been his first time off the harbor in weeks, and probably his last chance to change his fortune. The crumpled receipt from his withdrawal at Harbor First National sat on the kitchen counter next to his father's tools, a reminder of just how desperate he'd become. $3,000. The absolute last of his savings, spent on what everyone in town now considered the biggest mistake of his life. His brother Danny had made that clear during their phone call this morning. "Tom, what the hell were you thinking?" Danny's voice had carried the particular mix of exasperation and disappointment that only younger brothers could master. As a loan officer at Harbour First National, Danny saw the town's financial struggles from a different angle. He dealt in numbers and credit scores and realistic assessments of what people could afford. An unemployed mechanic buying a decommissioned submarine didn't fit any of his spreadsheets. "I was thinking about potential," Tom had replied, though even he wasn't sure what kind of potential he'd seen in that rusted hull. "Potential for what? You bought 30 tons of scrap metal, Tom. Scrap metal that you can't even move without hiring a crane service that'll cost more than you paid for the thing." Danny wasn't wrong. The USS Remora sat in the abandoned section of Kellerman shipyard like a beached whale, its black hull streaked with rust and bird droppings. At first glance, it looked like exactly what the auctioneer had described: surplus military equipment destined for the scrap heap. The submarine was small by Navy standards, maybe 200 feet long, with a conning tower that looked like it had been designed in the 1960s and forgotten about ever since. But Tom had seen something else during that brief inspection period before the auction. While other bidders had walked around the exterior, making jokes about buying their own submarine, Tom had noticed discrepancies. The hull showed signs of modification that didn't match the official specifications posted on the auction sheet. Welding marks that looked newer than the rest of the vessel, compartments that seemed to have been sealed after the original construction. Most telling of all, the submarine sat 15 feet from the water on massive steel cradles, positioned in a section of the shipyard that had been used for classified naval contracts during the Cold War. Tom remembered his father mentioning those projects in hushed tones, work that paid well but came with security clearances and non-disclosure agreements that lasted decades. The government surplus auction had been sparsely attended. A few scrap dealers looking for copper and steel, some military history buffs hoping for souvenirs, and Tom. When the auctioneer had opened, bidding at $500, Tom had been the only one to raise his hand. The price had climbed slowly, more out of curiosity than serious interest from the other bidders. At $3,000, Tom had found himself the owner of a Cold War submarine with no clear idea of what to do with it. The walk back to his apartment from the bus stop had been a gauntlet of whispers and pointing fingers. Millfield Harbour was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news of Tom's purchase had travelled faster than he had. By the time he'd climbed the stairs to his apartment, his phone was already ringing, with calls from neighbours wanting to know if he'd completely lost his mind. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store had been the kindest in her concern. "Tommy, honey, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should talk to someone about the stress you've been under." Others had been less diplomatic. Joe Brennan from the hardware store had left a voicemail that ended with, "Christ, Tom, even I know you can't sail a submarine on land." The worst had been the silence from Sarah. Sarah Martinez had been his girlfriend for 2 years before the shipyard closed. She'd stuck with him through the first few months of unemployment, even helped him update his resume and practice for job interviews that never led to offers. But as his savings dwindled and his prospects dimmed, she'd grown distant. Their last conversation, 3 weeks ago, had ended with her saying she needed space to think about things. He'd hoped she might call after hearing about the submarine, if only to express concern or curiosity. The silence spoke louder than any criticism could have. Tom poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd made before dawn and settled into his father's old recliner. Through the window, he could see the shipyard in the distance and the dark shape of his submarine sitting among the abandoned cranes and empty warehouses. In the morning light, it looked even more impossible than it had yesterday. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Everything has a purpose, mijo. Sometimes you just have to look deeper to find it." Tom had spent his career looking deeper into problems that others had given up on. Engines that wouldn't start, systems that made no sense, machinery that seemed to defy logic until you found the one loose connection or worn part that explained everything. Maybe this submarine was just another puzzle waiting to be solved. He finished his coffee, pulled on his work boots, and grabbed his father's toolbox. If he was going to be the laughingstock of Millfield Harbour, he might as well earn the title properly. The submarine was his now, for better or worse, and Tom Reyes had never walked away from a challenge that involved figuring out how something worked. The morning fog was beginning to lift as he walked toward the shipyard, his father's tools heavy in his hands, but his step a little lighter than it had been in months. Behind him, the town was waking up to another day of whispered gossip about the crazy mechanic who'd bought himself a submarine. Ahead of him lay 30 tons of mystery, waiting to be understood. Tom had no idea that he was walking toward a discovery that would change not just his life, but his understanding of what people were willing to do for money, power, and the secrets that bind them together. The smell hit Tom first, a mixture of rust, stagnant water, and something else he couldn't quite identify. As he climbed through the main hatch of the USS Remora, his flashlight beam revealed a submarine interior that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Personal belongings still sat on bunks, coffee cups remained on tables, and navigation charts were spread across the control room, as if the crew had just stepped out for a smoke break 37 years ago. Tom had expected flooding, but the submarine's compartments were surprisingly dry. His footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors as he made his way from the control room toward the engine compartment, noting how well maintained everything appeared despite the exterior rust. Someone had taken care to preserve this vessel before abandoning it, which raised questions about why it had ended up in a government surplus auction. The engine room told a different story. Here, Tom found evidence of hasty modifications, welding marks that looked fresh compared to the original construction, new electrical conduits that didn't match the 1960s-era wiring throughout the rest of the vessel. And most intriguingly, a bulkhead wall that didn't appear on any of the submarine schematics he'd studied online. The wall was solid steel, professionally welded, with no apparent access points. Tom ran his hands along its surface, feeling for any sign of a hidden door or panel. His mechanical instincts told him this wasn't original construction. The welding techniques were different, the steel composition felt newer, and the placement blocked what should have been a maintenance corridor, according to the submarine's official blueprints. He pulled out his father's measuring tape and began documenting the dimensions of the engine compartment, comparing them to the specifications he'd downloaded from the Naval History and Heritage Command website. The numbers didn't match. According to the official records, this section of the submarine should extend another 15 feet aft. The sealed bulkhead was blocking access to a significant portion of the vessel. Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from his brother. "Mom called. She's worried about you. Can we meet for lunch?" He typed back a quick response about being busy with the submarine, then returned his attention to the mysterious wall. Using a small hammer from his toolbox, Tom tapped along the bulkhead, listening for changes in the sound that might indicate hollow spaces behind the steel. Most of the surface produced the solid thunk of metal backed by more metal, but near the floor he found a section that rang differently, hollower, as if there was empty space beyond. He knelt down and examined the area more closely with his flashlight. Hidden beneath a layer of paint and grime, he could make out the faint outline of what looked like an access panel, maybe 2 feet square. The edges were barely visible, sealed with the same professional welding as the rest of the bulkhead, but definitely present. Tom's pulse quickened. In his 25 years of working on marine equipment, he'd learned to recognize when something had been deliberately concealed. This wasn't just a modification, this was a hiding place. He spent the next hour carefully cleaning the area around the hidden panel, using paint stripper from his toolkit to remove decades of accumulated coatings. As the metal became visible, he could see that the welding around the panel was different from the rest of the bulkhead, newer, but designed to look old. Someone had taken great care to make this section appear seamless while still maintaining access to whatever lay behind. The numbers etched into the metal near the panel's corner made no sense according to standard naval marking systems. Instead of the typical alphanumeric codes used by the Navy, these markings looked more like coordinates: 23.1378N, 82.3644W. Tom recognized the format from his father's fishing charts, latitude and longitude. He pulled out his phone and typed the coordinates into a mapping app. The location was in the Florida Straits, about 90 miles southwest of Key West. Deep water, far from any shipping lanes, in an area that would have been strategically important during the Cold War for monitoring Soviet submarine activity. Tom stared at the coordinates, wondering what connection they had to a sealed compartment in a decommissioned submarine sitting in a Massachusetts shipyard. His concentration was broken by the sound of footsteps on the submarine's deck above. Tom quickly turned off his flashlight and listened. The footsteps were deliberate, careful, not the casual walk of someone exploring out of curiosity. Someone was trying to move quietly. He made his way back to the control room, staying low and avoiding the sections of flooring that he'd noticed creaked during his earlier exploration. Through the periscope housing, he could see a figure on the deck, wearing dark clothing and carrying what looked like a camera with a telephoto lens. Tom waited until the figure moved toward the stern before climbing out of the submarine. By the time he reached the deck, whoever had been there was gone, but fresh footprints in the dust around the submarine's base told him he hadn't imagined the visitor. Someone had been photographing his submarine, and they'd been professional about it. As he walked back toward his apartment that evening, Tom's mind raced with possibilities. The sealed compartment, the mysterious coordinates, and now surveillance all suggested that his $3,000 purchase was connected to something much larger than a simple government surplus sale. His phone rang as he reached the diner below his apartment. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reyes?" The voice was professionally neutral, neither friendly nor threatening. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name isn't important. What matters is that you've purchased something that doesn't belong to you." Tom felt his stomach tighten. "I've got a bill of sale that says otherwise." "Bills of sale can be forged, Mr. Reyes. What you've bought is more complicated than you realize. I'd advise you to resell it immediately. There are buyers who would pay considerably more than you invested. Why would anyone pay more for scrap metal?" The caller was quiet for a moment. "Because smart men know when to walk away from things they don't understand. You seem like a smart man, Mr. Reyes. I hope you'll prove me right." The line went dead. Tom stood in the gathering dusk, looking across the harbor toward the shipyard where his submarine waited. The threatening phone call should have scared him. A smart man probably would have started making calls to scrap dealers immediately. But Tom Reyes had spent his whole life figuring out things that other people found too complicated to understand. He climbed the stairs to his apartment and spread his father's navigation charts across the kitchen table. Using a pencil, he marked the coordinates he'd found on the submarine. The location was in international waters, in an area his father had always warned him was dangerous for small boats due to unpredictable currents and frequent storms. But it was also an area where, according to the charts, the ocean floor dropped to over 1,000 feet deep enough to hide things that people didn't want found. Tom stared at the coordinates until his eyes grew heavy, but his mind refused to settle. Someone had modified his submarine to hide something in a sealed compartment. Someone was watching him. Someone wanted him to sell the submarine without investigating further. All of which meant that his father's old advice was more relevant than ever. Everything has a purpose. Sometimes you just have to look deeper to find it. The sealed bulkhead door represented more than just a mystery. It was the first piece of evidence that his submarine held secrets worth protecting. And if someone was willing to make threatening phone calls to keep him away from those secrets, Tom was more determined than ever to find out what lay behind that carefully concealed panel. Tomorrow, he would bring his cutting torch to the submarine. It was time to see what someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to hide. Tom arrived at the submarine before sunrise, his father's cutting torch and a portable generator loaded in a borrowed wheelbarrow from the diner. The morning air was crisp, and the harbour was still quiet, except for the distant sound of fishing boats heading out for the day's work. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over the threatening phone call and the mysterious coordinates. The cutting torch made quick work of the welded panel. As sparks flew in the submarine's engine room, Tom felt the familiar satisfaction of solving a mechanical puzzle. The welds had been expertly done, but they were no match for the right tools and enough determination. Within an hour, he'd cut through the perimeter of the hidden access panel. The metal section fell inward with a hollow clang, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the submarine. Tom's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, illuminating what appeared to be a cramped compartment about the size of a closet. The air that rushed out carried the smell of old paper and something metallic. Tom squeezed through the opening, his shoulders barely fitting in the narrow space. Inside the hidden compartment, he found a small table bolted to the floor, metal filing cabinets, and several waterproof containers. The beam of his flashlight settled on a collection of charts spread across the table, but these weren't standard naval navigation maps. The charts were hand-drawn on heavy paper, showing detailed coastlines and water depths around Cuba. Notations in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and what looked like Russian, marked specific locations along the Cuban coast. Dates ranged from 1984 to 1987, all during the height of Cold War tensions. Most interesting were the detailed depth soundings and underwater topographical features that wouldn't appear on any public charts. Tom carefully lifted one of the charts, noting the professional quality of the draftsmanship. These weren't the work of casual sailors. They showed the kind of precision that came from military-grade surveying equipment. Red X marks indicated specific locations, with coordinates and notes that referenced Package Alpha, Extraction Point Bravo, and other coded designations. One chart caught his attention immediately. It showed the exact coordinates he'd found etched near the access panel. 23.1378N, 82.3644W. The location was marked with a detailed diagram of what appeared to be an underwater valley, complete with depth measurements and notations about current patterns. Written in the margin was a name, U-461, final position. Tom's knowledge of naval history was limited, but he knew enough to recognize the designation of a German U-boat. U-461 would have been a World War II submarine, probably sunk during the Battle of the Atlantic. But what was it doing on charts from the 1980s? The sound of footsteps on the submarine's deck above interrupted his investigation. Tom quickly turned off his flashlight and listened. Unlike yesterday's careful surveillance, these footsteps were confident and approaching the main hatch. Someone was coming aboard. "Mr. Reyes?" The voice was female, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "I saw your light. I hope you don't mind the intrusion." Tom made his way back through the narrow passage and emerged from the engine room to find a woman in her 50s standing in the submarine's control room. She was dressed practically in jeans and a heavy sweater, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the submarine's interior. "I'm Elena Vasquez," she said, extending her hand. "I teach maritime history at the community college. I heard about your purchase, and I have to admit, I'm fascinated. Do you mind if I look around?" Tom studied her carefully. After yesterday's threatening phone call and surveillance, he wasn't inclined to trust unexpected visitors. But Elena's demeanor was open and curious, rather than threatening. "What kind of maritime history?" he asked. "Cold War naval operations, primarily. I've been researching Soviet submarine activity in the Caribbean during the 1980s. Your USS Remora has an interesting service record." That got Tom's attention. "What do you know about this submarine?" Elena smiled. "More than the government surplus auction would have told you, I suspect. The Remora was officially decommissioned in 1987, but it spent its last 3 years of service on classified missions. The crew rotated frequently, and the submarine's movements during that period aren't in any public records." Tom made a decision. "I found some charts that might interest you." He led Elena to the engine room and showed her the hidden compartment. Her eyes widened as she saw the opening he'd cut through the welded panel. "My God," she whispered, "someone went to considerable trouble to hide this." Tom squeezed through the passage and handed out several of the charts. Elena spread them across the submarine's navigation table, using her phone's flashlight to examine the details. "These are extraordinary," she said after several minutes of study. "The level of detail here represents months of survey work. And look at these dates, 1984 to 1987, exactly the period when the Remora was on classified assignment." She pointed to the chart, showing the U-461 location. "This is particularly interesting. U-461 was a German submarine that disappeared in 1943. It was carrying a cargo of looted art and gold when it went missing. The wreck was never found." "Until now?" Tom asked. "Possibly. These coordinates and depth measurements suggest someone not only found the wreck, but mapped it precisely." Elena's finger traced the detailed underwater topography. "This level of survey work would require specialized equipment, the kind that only military or well-funded salvage operations would have access to." Tom pulled out his phone and showed her the coordinates he'd photographed from near the access panel. Elena's expression grew troubled. "Mr. Reyes, I think you should know that you're not the first person to ask me about the Remora's service history. 3 weeks ago, a man contacted me, claiming to be writing a book about Cold War submarines. He was particularly interested in any records of the Remora's final missions." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing, because I didn't trust his story. He knew too much about classified operations to be a simple author, and he was asking very specific questions about crew members and cargo manifests." Elena gathered the charts carefully. These documents suggest that the Remora was involved in unauthorized salvage operations. Someone was using a U.S. Navy submarine to recover treasure from a German U-boat. That would explain the secrecy and the hidden compartment. Tom felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together. And if word got out that Navy personnel were treasure hunting on government time, it would be a massive scandal, career-ending for everyone involved, potentially criminal charges. Elena looked around the submarine's control room with new understanding. No wonder someone wants these documents to stay hidden. As if summoned by their conversation, Tom's phone rang. The same unknown number from yesterday appeared on the screen. He let it ring, but Elena noticed his expression. "Problems. Someone called yesterday warning me to sell the submarine. They said I'd bought something that didn't belong to me." Elena's face grew serious. "Mr. Reyes, I think you should consider taking that advice. If this submarine contains evidence of unauthorized military operations, there are people who would do anything to keep that information buried. People with resources and connections that a small-town mechanic can't compete with." Tom looked at the Soviet-era navigation charts spread across the table, thinking about the threatening phone call and the mysterious surveillance. Elena was probably right. The smart thing would be to sell the submarine to a scrap dealer and walk away with whatever profit he could manage. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Everything has a purpose, Mio." Maybe the purpose of buying this submarine wasn't just to solve his financial problems. Maybe it was to uncover a truth that had been buried for nearly 40 years. And maybe, for the first time since losing his job, Tom had found something worth fighting for. "I appreciate the warning," Tom said finally, "but I'm not ready to walk away yet. These charts represent something important, evidence of crimes that someone got away with. I think the people who were robbed deserve better than having their stolen property hidden forever." Elena studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. In that case, Mr. Race, I think you're going to need help, and I happen to know quite a bit about Cold War naval operations. Elena's expertise proved invaluable over the next 3 days. She helped Tom systematically explore every compartment of the submarine, using her knowledge of Cold War-era naval operations to identify modifications and anomalies that he would have missed. Their most significant discovery came in what should have been the captain's quarters. Behind a false panel in the captain's private bathroom, they found a second hidden compartment containing personal belongings that had been deliberately concealed. The space was small but carefully organized, containing a leather-bound logbook, photographs, and a manila envelope sealed with wax. The logbook belonged to Captain James Morrison, the Remora's commanding officer during its final years of service. Elena translated the dated entries while Tom photographed each page with his phone, creating a backup record of their discoveries. "Listen to this," Elena said, reading from an entry dated March 15, 1987. Package recovery successful. Cargo manifest includes 847 gold bars, various precious stones, and artistic works as catalogued. Total estimated value exceeds previous projections. Crew morale remains high despite extended operations. Tom looked up from photographing a collection of old Polaroid pictures. Package recovery? That sounds like they were salvaging the German U-boat. It gets worse. Elena continued reading. April 3, 1987. Washington contact confirms operation termination. All evidence to be secured pending final disposition. Crew reassignments effective immediately. Personal effects and documentation to be destroyed per security protocols. The photographs Tom was cataloging told a disturbing story. They showed the interior of what was clearly a German World War II submarine, with crew members in U.S. Navy uniforms posing next to stacks of gold bars and wooden crates. The submarine's markings were visible in several shots. U-461, exactly matching the designation on the charts. One photograph showed Captain Morrison standing next to an open crate filled with what appeared to be jewelry and small artifacts. His expression was triumphant, like a hunter posing with a trophy. Another showed crew members loading sealed containers onto what Tom recognized as the Remora, based on distinctive features of the submarine's torpedo room. "Elena, look at this," Tom said, handing her a photograph that showed a close-up of one of the containers being loaded. Stenciled on its side was USN Classified, authorized personnel only. Elena studied the image. They were using official Navy containers to transport stolen treasure. This wasn't just unauthorized salvage, it was theft, using government resources. The sealed envelope contained the most damning evidence yet. Inside were photocopied documents that appeared to be official Navy correspondence, including orders for the Remora's final mission and communications between Captain Morrison and someone identified only as Washington contact. One memorandum, dated May 10, 1987, was particularly revealing. Operation Depth Charge concluded successfully. Total recovery value confirmed at $188.4 million. Recommend immediate crew dispersal and document destruction. Political sensitivity requires complete operational security. All personnel to receive standard discharge procedures. Cargo disposition to be handled through established channels. Elena sat back in the captain's chair, looking stunned. "Tom, this is evidence of a massive conspiracy. They recovered nearly $200 million in stolen treasure using a U.S. Navy submarine, then covered it up by decommissioning the vessel and scattering the crew." Tom was studying the final entries in Captain Morrison's logbook. According to this, Morrison was supposed to destroy all evidence before the submarine was decommissioned. But he kept copies of everything. Insurance, Elena suggested. If the operation ever came to light, he wanted proof that he was following orders from above. Their investigation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the shipyard. Through the submarine's periscope, Tom could see two black SUVs parking near the shipyard entrance. Men in dark suits were getting out, moving with the purposeful coordination of law enforcement or military personnel. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, quickly gathering the most important documents. Tom was way ahead of her, stuffing Captain Morrison's logbook and the photographs into his toolbox. They squeezed through the hidden compartment's access panel, Tom sealing it behind them as best he could. By the time they emerged from the submarine's main hatch, the men in suits were halfway across the shipyard. "Mr. Reyes?" The lead figure was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Agent Rex Hawthorne, private security consultant. I'd like to have a conversation with you about your recent purchase." Tom noticed that Hawthorne's men had spread out around the submarine, cutting off obvious escape routes. These weren't federal agents. Their equipment and tactics had the professional efficiency of military contractors. "What kind of conversation?" Tom asked. Hawthorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The kind where reasonable people find mutually beneficial solutions to complicated problems. I represent clients who have a legitimate interest in this vessel and its contents. The vessel belongs to me. I have a bill of sale. Bills of sale don't always reflect the complete legal picture, Mr. Reyes. Sometimes previous owners retain rights to specific contents, especially when those contents were never officially transferred." Elena stepped closer to Tom, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. "Are you claiming that someone still owns cargo aboard this submarine?" Hawthorne's attention shifted to her, and Tom saw his expression sharpen with recognition. "Dr. Vasquez, isn't it? You've been asking questions about Cold War submarine operations. I hope you found the answers educational." "Educational enough," Elena replied, "particularly the parts about unauthorized military operations and theft of recovered treasure." "Theft is a strong word," Hawthorne said. "Salvage operations in international waters follow complex maritime law. What one person calls theft, another might call legitimate recovery of abandoned property." Tom had heard enough. "What do you want?" "I want to make you an offer. My clients are prepared to purchase this submarine from you for $50,000, a significant profit on your investment. In return, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. Everyone wins." $50,000 would solve Tom's immediate financial problems, and then some. It was more money than he'd seen in months, enough to restart his life somewhere else. All he had to do was walk away from a mystery that was clearly dangerous. But the photographs of Captain Morrison posing with stolen treasure kept flashing through his mind. People had died during World War II fighting the Nazis, and their stolen wealth had ended up in the hands of corrupt American military officers who'd covered up their crimes for 40 years. "I'll need to think about it," Tom said. Hawthorne's smile disappeared. "I'm afraid this is a time-sensitive offer, Mr. Reyes. My clients value discretion above all else. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the more complicated it becomes for everyone involved." "How complicated?" "Well, for instance, Dr. Vasquez here has a very nice position at the community college. It would be unfortunate if questions were raised about her academic integrity or her involvement in unauthorized historical research." Elena's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm pointing out that everyone has something to lose when situations escalate beyond reasonable bounds. Mr. Reyes has his reputation in the community to consider. You have your career. I have clients who value results over methods." Tom felt his temper rising. "And what happens if I don't take your offer?" "Then my clients will be forced to pursue other avenues for protecting their interests. Legal challenges to your ownership, investigations into how you obtained classified materials, that sort of thing. The process can be quite lengthy and expensive, even when it ultimately favors the defendant." Hawthorne pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Tom. "You have 24 hours to consider the offer. After that, the situation becomes much more difficult for all parties involved." The security team withdrew as efficiently as they'd arrived, leaving Tom and Elena standing beside the submarine in the gathering dusk. Tom stared at the business card, which listed only a phone number and Hawthorne's name. "Tom," Elena said quietly, "maybe you should take the money. $50,000 is more than fair, and these people obviously have resources we can't compete with." Tom looked at the submarine, thinking about Captain Morrison's hidden logbook and the evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military. Then he thought about his father, who'd taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were against you. "Elena, do you really believe that treasure belongs to Hawthorne's clients?" "No," she admitted. "I think it belongs in a museum, or returned to the families it was stolen from. But believing something and being able to prove it are two different things." Tom pulled out his phone and took a picture of Hawthorne's business card, then tore it up and let the pieces scatter in the harbor breeze. "Then I guess we better figure out how to prove it," he said, "because I'm not walking away from this." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "In that case, we're going to need more evidence, and we're going to need to be very careful about how we gather it." As they walked back toward town, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But for the first time since losing his job, he felt like he was fighting for something that mattered more than just his own survival. Elena's research skills proved crucial over the following week. While Tom continued his mechanical exploration of the submarine, she worked through maritime law databases and military archives, building a paper trail that supported their growing understanding of Operation Depth Charge. Her most significant breakthrough came when she discovered archived manifest records that had been misfiled in the Naval Historical Center's digital database. The manifest documents were bureaucratic gold official Navy paperwork that had somehow escaped the systematic destruction of records related to the Remora's final missions. They showed requisitions for specialized deep-water salvage equipment, extended deployment rations, and most damaging of all, official transfer orders for recovered historical artifacts to be stored at an unnamed secure facility pending disposition. "Tom, look at this," Elena said, spreading the printed documents across his kitchen table. "These requisitions are dated 2 weeks before the official discovery of the U-461 wreck site. Someone knew exactly where that submarine was and what they expected to find." The forged manifest that Elena had uncovered was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deception. It showed the official transfer of historical artifacts from the USS Remora to a facility listed only as Warehouse 7, Norfolk Naval Station. But when Elena contacted the base historian, she learned that no such warehouse had existed in 1987. "They created fake documentation to make the theft look legitimate," Tom said, studying the forged signatures on the transfer orders. "Someone with access to official forms and Navy letterhead." Elena nodded. "And someone with enough authority to make sure the paperwork was filed in the right places to avoid scrutiny. This wasn't a rogue operation, it was planned at the highest levels." Their investigation was interrupted by a knock at Tom's apartment door. Through the peephole, he could see his brother Danny standing in the hallway, looking agitated and carrying a manila folder. "Danny, what are you doing here?" Danny pushed past him into the apartment, nodding briefly at Elena before turning to face his brother. "Tom, we need to talk. Privately." Elena gathered her research materials. "I'll wait in the car." When she was gone, Danny sat heavily at the kitchen table and opened his folder. Inside were bank documents and what looked like legal papers. "Tom, I got a call today from someone claiming to represent your interests. They said you were considering selling the submarine, but needed financing to complete some kind of restoration project first. I never asked anyone to represent my interests." "That's what I figured. But Tom, they knew things about your financial situation that they shouldn't know. Details about your unemployment benefits, your savings account balance, even the fact that you sold Dad's truck last month." Tom felt a chill. "What kind of details?" Danny spread out the bank documents. They offered to loan you $100,000 secured against the submarine. When I told them that was impossible because the submarine isn't worth that much as collateral, they said they had access to independent appraisals that suggested otherwise. Independent appraisals of what? That's what worries me. Tom, how could anyone appraise a submarine for more than scrap value unless they knew something about its contents? Tom studied the loan documents, noting that they came from a private financial firm he'd never heard of. The terms were suspiciously favorable: low interest rates, minimal documentation requirements, and a clause that allowed the lender to take possession of the submarine if payments were missed. Danny, this is a trap. They're trying to get legal ownership of the submarine through a financial arrangement. Maybe. But Tom, there's something else. Danny pulled out a second set of papers. I ran some background checks on that Hawthorne guy who's been bothering you. He's not just a private security consultant. He's got connections to military contracting firms and what look like intelligence agencies. His company has done work for the CIA and Defense Department. Tom felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. He's not just representing private clients. He's working for the people who organized the original theft, which means they have resources we can't compete with. Tom, take the $50,000. Walk away while you still can. Before Tom could respond, Elena knocked on the door. When he let her back in, her face was pale with worry. Tom, we have a problem. I just got a call from my department chair at the college. Someone filed a complaint about my research activities, claiming I've been accessing classified materials without proper authorization. Can they prove that? They don't need to prove anything. The mere allegation is enough to trigger a formal investigation. I could lose my job, my pension, everything I've worked for. Danny looked between Tom and Elena with growing alarm. This is exactly what I'm talking about. These people have the power to destroy your lives just by making a few phone calls. Tom walked to his window and looked out toward the harbor, where the submarine sat, waiting in the shipyard. The smart play was obvious: take Hawthorne's money, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and let someone else worry about 40-year-old crimes. He'd be financially secure, Elena would keep her job, and Danny wouldn't have to worry about his brother's safety. But the photograph of Captain Morrison posing with stolen treasure kept haunting him. Somewhere there were families who still wondered what had happened to their ancestors' belongings, museums that had never recovered their stolen art, and victims of Nazi theft who had died without knowing that justice might someday be possible. Elena, Tom said finally, if we published everything we've found, the photographs, the logbooks, the forged manifests, what would happen? Legally, probably nothing after 40 years. But historically, it would expose a massive cover-up. The families of Holocaust victims whose property was stolen might finally have answers about what happened to their belongings. And politically, it would be a nightmare for anyone who was involved. Military careers destroyed, congressional investigations, international embarrassment for the U.S. Navy. Tom turned back to his brother. Danny, what if we could prove that the people threatening us are the same ones who committed the original crimes? How? By making them prove their ownership of the treasure. If Hawthorne really represents the legal owners, he should be able to produce documentation showing how his clients acquired nearly $200 million worth of Nazi-looted gold and art. Elena's eyes widened with understanding. He can't do that because the only way to legally own that treasure is to have stolen it from a German U-boat in 1987. Danny shook his head. You're talking about forcing a confrontation with people who have unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. Maybe. But I'm also talking about finally getting justice for people who've been waiting for it for 40 years. Tom looked at the research materials spread across his kitchen table. Dad always told me that everything has a purpose. Maybe my purpose isn't just to fix broken things. Maybe it's to fix broken systems. Elena gathered her documents. Tom, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. That means documenting everything, creating multiple backup copies, and making sure the evidence gets to people who can't be bought or intimidated. And we need to be prepared for them to escalate their tactics, Danny added reluctantly. If financial pressure and job threats don't work, they'll try something more direct. Tom thought about Hawthorne's men spreading out around the submarine, cutting off escape routes with military precision. Then, we better make sure we're ready for whatever they try next. As Elena prepared to leave, Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. 24 hours expire at midnight. Final offer, $75K. After that, situation becomes difficult. Tom showed the message to Elena and Danny. The offer had increased by 50%, which meant their research was making Hawthorne nervous. Nervous people with unlimited resources were dangerous, but they were also more likely to make mistakes. Elena, how long would it take you to get copies of everything to a major newspaper or magazine? If I worked all night, I could have a complete package ready by morning. Tom deleted the text message without responding. Then that's what we do. We go public with everything before they can stop us. Danny stood up slowly, looking older than his 42 years. Tom, I hope you know what you're doing. I don't, Tom admitted. But I know what I'm not doing. I'm not walking away from the biggest injustice I've ever stumbled across, just because someone with money and connections tells me to. As his brother left that evening, Tom felt the weight of his decision settling over him. He was committed now to a course of action that would either expose one of the biggest military scandals in decades or destroy what remained of his life in Millfield Harbor. There was no middle ground left, and the people arrayed against him had made it clear that they valued discretion above human decency. But Tom Reyes had never backed down from a fight when he knew he was right. And 40 years of injustice was long enough. Tomorrow, the world would learn about Operation Depth Charge and the men who had turned a U.S. Navy submarine into their personal treasure-hunting vessel. Whatever happened after that, at least the truth would finally see daylight. Elena arrived at Tom's apartment at 6 in the morning, carrying 2 large coffee cups and a radiation detector she'd borrowed from the college's geology department. Her research had uncovered a disturbing detail in one of Captain Morrison's logbook entries that mentioned special precautions for Package Delta. Tom, I think we need to check something, she said, setting up the Geiger counter on his kitchen table. One of Morrison's entries from April 1987 mentions radiation shielding procedures for certain cargo items. If the German U-boat was carrying radioactive materials, the detector began clicking rapidly as soon as Elena turned it on. Tom looked at the digital readout, which showed elevated radiation levels significantly above normal background readings. Is that coming from the submarine? Tom asked. Elena moved the detector around the apartment, noting that the readings increased when she pointed it toward the harbor. It's definitely stronger in the direction of the shipyard. Tom, we may be dealing with more than just stolen gold and art. If there are radioactive materials aboard that submarine, this becomes a public health issue. Tom thought about the sealed containers he'd seen in Captain Morrison's photographs, some marked with symbols he hadn't recognized at the time. You think the Nazis were experimenting with nuclear materials? It's possible. The German nuclear program was more advanced than most people realize, and they were definitely working on radiological weapons near the end of the war. If U-461 was carrying experimental materials when it sank. Elena was interrupted by Tom's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. Tom had never heard of Agent Chen, but after Hawthorne's visit, any federal contact made him nervous. Mr. Reyes, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to meet with you this morning to discuss your recent purchase and some concerns that have been brought to our attention. What kind of concerns? The kind that are better discussed in person. I can be at your location in 30 minutes, or we can meet somewhere more convenient for you. Tom looked at Elena, who was shaking her head vigorously while pointing at the radiation detector. The readings were now showing levels that, while not immediately dangerous, were definitely concerning for prolonged exposure. Agent Chen, can you tell me what this is about? Mr. Reyes, we have reliable information suggesting that your submarine may contain materials that pose a risk to public safety, specifically radioactive materials that require proper handling and disposal by qualified personnel. Elena grabbed a notepad and wrote, "Don't meet her alone. Public place only. I can meet you at Murphy's Diner in 30 minutes, Tom said. It's the place below my apartment. That will be fine. Mr. Reyes, I want to assure you that you're not in any legal trouble. We're primarily concerned with ensuring public safety and recovering materials that may pose environmental hazards." After hanging up, Tom looked at Elena with growing concern. "How did the FBI know about radioactive materials? We just discovered them ourselves 20 minutes ago." "Someone's been monitoring the situation very closely," Elena said. "The question is whether Agent Chen is trying to help us or shut us down." They moved Elena's research materials to Tom's bedroom and made the apartment look as normal as possible before heading down to the diner. Murphy's was busy with the morning breakfast crowd, providing enough witnesses to make Tom feel safer about the meeting. Agent Chen arrived exactly on time, a woman in her 30s with short black hair and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested federal training. She showed her credentials and sat across from Tom in a corner booth, declining Elena's offer to give them privacy. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand you've been assisting Mr. Reyes with research into his submarine's history. Your expertise in Cold War naval operations could be valuable to our investigation." "What investigation?" Elena asked. "We've received reports that the USS Remora may contain undocumented materials from its final deployment period. Materials that were never properly inventoried when the vessel was decommissioned." Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and showed them satellite images of the shipyard. "Our preliminary scans confirm the presence of radioactive signatures consistent with materials that require federal oversight." Tom studied the satellite images, which showed heat signatures and what looked like radiation mapping data. "You've been scanning my submarine from space." "Routine monitoring, Mr. Reyes. When reports surface about potentially hazardous materials, we're required to investigate." Agent Chen put away the tablet. "The good news is that we can handle the removal and disposal of these materials at no cost to you. We simply need access to document everything and ensure proper safety protocols." Elena leaned forward. "Agent Chen, what happens to any non-radioactive materials that might be aboard the submarine? Historical artifacts, documents, that sort of thing?" "All materials would be properly catalogued and disposed of according to federal regulations. Items of historical significance would be turned over to appropriate museums or archives, and items of monetary value." Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but Tom noticed a slight pause before she answered. "Any valuable items recovered from federal property would be handled according to established procedures for government assets." Tom felt his suspicions growing. "Agent Chen, can you tell me how long you've been investigating the Remora?" "Our investigation began when we received reports about your purchase and the potential safety hazards involved." "Reports from whom?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the sources of our information, Mr. Reyes. What matters is ensuring public safety and proper handling of hazardous materials." Elena pulled out her phone and showed Agent Chen one of the photographs they'd discovered. "Agent Chen, are you familiar with Operation Depth Charge?" For the first time, Agent Chen's professional composure cracked slightly. Tom saw recognition flash across her face before she regained control. "I'm not familiar with any operation by that name. Dr. Vasquez, where did you obtain that photograph?" "From Captain Morrison's personal effects aboard the submarine. There are quite a few more, along with detailed logbooks documenting unauthorized salvage operations." Agent Chen studied the photograph for a long moment. "Mr. Reyes, I'm going to be direct with you. If this submarine contains evidence of unauthorized military operations from the 1980s, That information is classified, regardless of how you obtained it. Publishing or distributing such materials could result in serious federal charges, even if those operations involved theft and cover-ups. Especially then, national security interests sometimes require difficult decisions and ongoing protection of sensitive information. Tom felt a chill of understanding. Agent Chen wasn't here to help them. She was here to suppress their investigation using the authority of federal law enforcement. Agent Chen, what happens if I refuse to give you access to the submarine? Then we would be forced to obtain a warrant and conduct a mandatory safety inspection. The process would be much more disruptive and time-consuming, but the end result would be the same. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. Tom, we need to leave. Now. Is there a problem? Agent Chen asked. My department chair just texted. Federal agents are searching my office at the college, claiming I've been in possession of classified materials. Agent Chen stood up smoothly. Dr. Vasquez, I'd advise you to cooperate fully with that investigation. Possession of classified materials is a serious federal crime, regardless of how those materials were obtained. Tom realized they were trapped. Agent Chen and her investigation weren't separate from Hawthorne's threats. They were part of the same effort to suppress the truth about Operation Depth Charge. The difference was that the FBI had legal authority to back up their demands. Agent Chen, Tom said carefully, what if I wanted to voluntarily turn over any potentially hazardous materials for proper disposal? That would be the responsible course of action. We could have a disposal team at the submarine within hours, and in exchange, you'd be thanked by a grateful government for your civic responsibility. No charges would be filed, and you'd be free to sell your submarine to any qualified scrap dealer. Tom looked at Elena, who was gathering her things with obvious urgency. The federal investigation of her office meant their time had run out faster than expected. Within hours, agents would have copies of all their research, and any evidence of the cover-up would disappear into classified files. I'll consider your offer, Tom told Agent Chen. Can I have until this evening to make a decision? Of course. But Mr. Reyes, I want to be clear about the consequences of delay. Every hour that potentially hazardous materials remain unsecured increases the risk to public safety. If someone were to be injured because of unnecessary delays. I understand, Tom cut her off. I'll call you before 6 o'clock. As Agent Chen left the diner, Tom felt the walls closing in from all sides. Hawthorne's people were threatening Elena's job, and probably worse. The FBI was preparing to seize the submarine and classify all evidence of the conspiracy. And somewhere in Washington, people who had committed crimes 40 years ago were using the full power of the federal government to protect their secrets. Elena grabbed his arm. Tom, we have maybe 4 hours before they shut us down completely. If we're going to expose this, it has to be now. Tom thought about the radiation detector readings and the federal agents searching Elena's office. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. But they still had one advantage. They knew the truth, and their enemies were terrified of what would happen if that truth became public. Elena, how fast can you get our evidence to a reporter who can't be intimidated or bought off? There's the investigative journalist at the Washington Post who specializes in military scandals. If I can get everything to her in the next 2 hours. Do it, Tom said. And Elena, make sure you keep yourself safe. These people have already shown they're willing to destroy careers. I don't want you to be the next casualty. As they prepared to leave the diner, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The federal investigation had escalated the situation beyond anything Hawthorne had threatened, and the stakes were now higher than just money or careers. They were fighting for the truth against people who had unlimited resources and 40 years of experience keeping secrets buried. Elena's contact at the Washington Post was scheduled to receive their evidence package at 3 o'clock that afternoon. At 2:47, she called Tom with news that changed everything they thought they knew about their investigation. Tom, You need to see this immediately, Elena said, her voice tight with anxiety. I found Agent Chen's real credentials. Tom was in the submarine's control room, photographing the last of Captain Morrison's personal effects before the federal seizure that seemed inevitable. What do you mean? Her real credentials? She's not FBI. I ran her badge number through a contact I have at the Bureau. There's no Agent Sarah Chen currently assigned to any New England field office. But there is a Sarah Chen who works for the CIA's Domestic Operations Division. Tom felt the world shift around him. CIA? What's the CIA doing investigating a decommissioned submarine? That's what I thought you'd ask. So, I did some deeper digging into Operation Depth Charge. Elena's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Tom, it wasn't just unauthorized treasure hunting. It was a CIA black operations funding scheme. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. They were using stolen Nazi treasure to fund covert operations. Exactly. The CIA needed untraceable money for operations that Congress wouldn't authorize. What better source than treasure that officially didn't exist, recovered from a German U-boat that had been missing for 40 years? Tom sank into the captain's chair, staring at Captain Morrison's logbook. The entries about Washington contact and operational security suddenly made perfect sense. Morrison hadn't been just a corrupt naval officer, he'd been a CIA asset. Elena, if the CIA organized the original theft, then Agent Chen isn't here to investigate. She's here to clean up. Tom, we're not just fighting treasure hunters and corrupt military officers, we're fighting the Central Intelligence Agency. Tom thought about Chen's offer to properly dispose of the radioactive materials and her threats about classified information. The CIA had legal authority to seize materials related to national security, and they had decades of experience making inconvenient evidence disappear. There's more, Elena continued. I found Morrison's obituary from 1989. He died in a car accident 2 years after the Remora was decommissioned. Single-vehicle collision on a clear night, no apparent cause. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the submarine's damp interior. You think they killed him? I think Morrison became a liability. He kept detailed records of everything, including the CIA's involvement. As long as he was alive, he was a potential witness to one of the biggest intelligence scandals in history. Tom looked around the submarine's control room, realizing that he was sitting in the scene of a crime that reached to the highest levels of the U.S. government. The treasure from U-461 hadn't just disappeared into private hands. It had been used to fund CIA operations that Congress had never authorized, never approved, and never overseen. Elena, how many people do you think knew about this? At the CIA? Probably a small group in the Operations Directorate, but the money had to go somewhere, which means there were probably officials in other agencies who knew they were receiving funding from classified sources. Tom's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed Agent Chen's number. Mr. Reyes, I'm calling to follow up on our conversation this morning. Have you reached a decision about cooperating with our safety inspection? Tom looked at Captain Morrison's logbook, thinking about a naval officer who had trusted the wrong people and died for it 2 years later. Agent Chen, can I ask you something? How long have you been tracking the materials aboard this submarine? As I mentioned, our investigation began recently, based on reports we received. Reports from whom? Mr. Reyes. I'm not at liberty to discuss operational details. What I can tell you is that time is running short for a voluntary resolution. Tom made a decision that surprised him. Agent Chen, I know who you really work for. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Chen spoke again, her voice had lost its professional warmth. Mr. Reyes, I think there may be some confusion about my credentials or authority. Perhaps we should meet again to clarify the situation. I don't think there's any confusion. You work for the CIA, and you're here to recover evidence of Operation Depth Charge before it becomes public. Another long silence. Tom could almost hear Chen calculating her options. Mr. Reyes, if you believe you have information relevant to national security matters, the appropriate course of action is to turn that information over to qualified authorities for proper handling. Authorities like you. Authorities like the people who have been protecting this country's interests for the past 40 years, sometimes making difficult decisions that civilians don't have the clearance to understand. Tom felt his anger rising. Difficult decisions like stealing treasure from Holocaust victims and using it to fund illegal operations. Mr. Reyes, you're discussing matters that are classified at the highest levels. Publication or distribution of such information would constitute a serious breach of national security law, even if those matters involve crimes. Especially then, national security sometimes requires protecting information that, if released, would damage ongoing operations and endanger American lives. Tom realized that Chen was no longer pretending to be FBI. She was speaking as a CIA operative who'd been authorized to do whatever was necessary to protect Operation Depth Charge. Agent Chen, what happened to Captain Morrison? I'm not familiar with that name in connection with our current investigation. He was the commanding officer of the USS Remora during Operation Depth Charge. He died in a car accident in 1989, 2 years after the operation ended. Mr. Reyes, if you're implying that the U.S. government was involved in any wrongful death, you're venturing into territory that could result in serious legal consequences for you personally. Tom looked around the submarine's control room, imagining Morrison sitting in this same chair while his crew loaded stolen treasure into official Navy containers. The captain had thought he was serving his country, but he'd actually been serving men who saw him as expendable once his usefulness ended. Agent Chen, I'm going to ask you directly. Was Captain Morrison killed to protect Operation Depth Charge? Mr. Reyes, this conversation has moved beyond matters I can discuss over an unsecured line. I strongly advise you to consider the full implications of your situation before taking any irreversible actions. Is that a threat? It's a professional assessment. You've stumbled into a situation involving classified operations that have been protected for nearly 4 decades. The people responsible for that protection have extensive resources and broad authority to use them. Tom felt the weight of 40 years of government power arrayed against him. The CIA had killed Morrison to protect their secret, and they wouldn't hesitate to do the same to anyone else who threatened to expose Operation Depth Charge. Agent Chen, what if I was willing to forget everything I've discovered in exchange for being left alone? That would be the wisest course of action. Complete discretion in exchange for being able to resume your normal life. Tom thought about Elena, whose career was already being destroyed simply for helping him research the submarine's history. He thought about the families of Holocaust victims who still didn't know what had happened to their stolen property. And he thought about Morrison, who had trusted the wrong people and paid with his life. I'll consider your advice, Tom said finally. Mr. Reyes, consideration is a luxury you may not have much longer. Situations like this have a tendency to escalate quickly once they reach a certain threshold. After Chen hung up, Tom sat in Morrison's chair staring at the logbook that had documented one of the biggest intelligence scandals in American history. The CIA had used a Navy submarine to steal nearly $200 million in Nazi treasure, then murdered the commanding officer when he became a liability. Elena called back within minutes. Tom, did you talk to Agent Chen? She dropped the FBI act. Now she's making direct threats as a CIA operative. Tom, we have to get this information public immediately. I'm driving to Washington right now to hand-deliver everything to the Post reporter. Elena, if they killed Morrison to protect this secret, then we're both already dead, unless we get the truth out first. The only protection we have is publicity. Tom looked around the submarine one more time, knowing it would probably be the last chance he'd have before the CIA seized everything. But hidden in his father's toolbox were copies of Morrison's logbook and photographs that Elena had already sent to Washington. The CIA had spent 40 years protecting Operation Depth Charge, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd trusted a small-town mechanic to walk away from the biggest injustice he'd ever discovered. Tom Reyes had never backed down from a fight when he knew he was right, and even the Central Intelligence Agency couldn't change that. Tom spent the next 6 hours turning his submarine from a historical artifact into a fortress. If the CIA was willing to kill to protect Operation Depth Charge, he needed every advantage he could create, using his mechanical expertise and intimate knowledge of the vessel's systems. His first priority was restoring power to the submarine's electrical systems. The Remora's diesel generators were beyond repair, but Tom jury-rigged a connection to the shipyard's electrical grid using cables he'd salvaged from abandoned cranes. Within 2 hours, he had lights, ventilation, and most importantly, the submarine's internal communication system. The torpedo tubes required more creative engineering. The Remora's original torpedo loading system had been disabled when the submarine was decommissioned, but the mechanical infrastructure remained intact. Tom couldn't make the tubes fire actual torpedoes, but he could use compressed air from the submarine's ballast system to create powerful water jets that would discourage anyone trying to board through the forward hatches. Elena called at 4 o'clock with an update that made Tom's defensive preparations seem even more urgent. "Tom, the Washington Post is running the story tomorrow morning. Front page, above the fold, with full documentation of Operation Depth Charge." How did they verify everything so quickly? They didn't have to. They've been investigating CIA funding irregularities for months as part of a larger series on intelligence oversight. Our evidence filled in missing pieces of a puzzle they were already working on. Tom tested the submarine's internal lighting system, making sure he could control which sections were illuminated and which remained dark. "Elena, where are you now?" "Safe house in D.C. The Post arranged security after I explained what we're dealing with. Tom, you need to get out of there immediately. If the story breaks tomorrow morning, they'll come for you tonight." Tom looked around the submarine's control room, where he'd spent the afternoon installing motion sensors and improvised alarm systems using parts from the shipyard's security equipment. "I'm not running, Elena. This submarine is the only physical evidence of what happened. If I abandon it, they'll destroy everything and claim the story is fabrication. Tom, they'll destroy you if you stay." "Maybe, but they'll have to work for it." Tom had spent the afternoon studying the submarine's ballast system, learning how to control the flooding of individual compartments. The Remora was sitting on steel cradles 15 feet from the water, but the incoming tide would bring the harbor level to within 5 feet of the submarine's hull. If necessary, Tom could flood the ballast tanks and use hydraulic jacks to slide the submarine into the water, not enough to make it seaworthy, but enough to give him tactical options his enemies wouldn't expect. At 6 o'clock, Tom's brother Danny arrived at the shipyard, driving his bank's security truck and carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches from the diner. "Tom, please tell me you're not planning to barricade yourself inside this thing like some kind of nautical survivalist." "I'm planning to protect the only physical evidence of a 40-year conspiracy until the story breaks tomorrow morning." Danny climbed through the main hatch and looked around the control room, noting the restored electrical systems and improvised communications equipment. "Tom, this is insane. You're talking about fighting the CIA with a decommissioned submarine. I'm talking about holding them off for 12 hours until the Washington Post exposes Operation Depth Charge." Tom showed Danny the submarine's restored sonar system, which he'd configured to detect approaching vessels. "After that, they'll have no reason to silence me. Unless they decide to silence you out of revenge." Tom had considered that possibility. The CIA operatives behind Operation Depth Charge had spent 40 years protecting their secret. Even after exposure, they might want to eliminate anyone who could testify about their crimes. "Danny, I need you to do something for me. If this goes bad tonight, make sure Elena has protection." She's the real expert on this story. Without her research, none of this would have come to light. Danny sat in the submarine's navigation chair, looking older than his 42 years. Tom, there has to be another way. What if you contacted the FBI, the real FBI, and turned over everything as evidence of CIA crimes? The real FBI would probably have to turn everything over to the CIA for national security review. Internal intelligence oversight is handled by the same people who committed the original crimes. Tom's improvised alarm system chimed, indicating motion near the submarine's perimeter. Through the periscope, he could see vehicles approaching the shipyard, 2 black SUVs and what looked like a government sedan. "Danny, you need to leave. Now. I'm not abandoning you." "You're not abandoning me. You're making sure someone knows what happened if they succeed in covering this up." Danny reluctantly climbed out of the submarine as the vehicles parked near the shipyard entrance. Tom sealed the main hatch and activated his internal lighting system, flooding the submarine with bright light that would make it difficult for anyone outside to see clearly into the interior. Through the periscope, Tom watched Rex Hawthorne emerge from one of the SUVs, followed by Agent Chen and several men in tactical gear. They approached the submarine with the coordinated movement of a military assault team, which meant they decided to abandon any pretense of legal authority. Tom's phone rang. Agent Chen's number appeared on the caller ID. "Mr. Reyes, this is your final opportunity to resolve this situation peacefully. We're prepared to offer you complete immunity and financial compensation in exchange for your cooperation." "What kind of financial compensation?" $200,000, deposited in an offshore account of your choosing. In exchange, you turn over all materials related to your investigation and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Tom looked around the submarine's control room, calculating his tactical advantages. The narrow hatches meant attackers would have to enter one at a time. The restored electrical systems gave him control over lighting and internal communications, and the ballast system provided options they wouldn't expect. "Agent Chen, what guarantee do I have that you won't kill me after I cooperate?" Captain Morrison cooperated, and he died in a car accident 2 years later. Captain Morrison's death was an unfortunate accident that had nothing to do with his naval service. "Just like my death will be an unfortunate accident if I don't cooperate?" "Mr. Reyes, you're making this situation much more difficult than it needs to be. We're offering you a generous settlement and the opportunity to resume your normal life." Tom thought about Morrison's logbook, where the captain had documented his growing concerns about the operation's legality. The final entries suggested that Morrison had been planning to report the theft to proper authorities before his convenient death. "Agent Chen, I have a counteroffer. You have until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning to surrender yourselves to federal authorities and confess your involvement in Operation Depth Charge. After that, the Washington Post publishes everything." "Mr. Reyes, you're not in a position to make demands. We'll see about that." Tom activated the submarine's ballast pumps, flooding the forward tanks with harbor water. The Remora's bow began to settle toward the water, shifting the angle of the submarine and making it more difficult for anyone to approach the forward hatches. Through the periscope, he could see Chen's team regrouping as they realized the submarine was moving. Hawthorne was gesturing angrily, probably arguing for a direct assault, while Chen appeared to be coordinating with someone by radio, likely her CIA superiors in Washington. Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "Story confirmed for tomorrow's front page. Hold on for 8 more hours." 8 hours might as well have been 8 days when facing a CIA cleanup team with unlimited resources and no legal constraints. But Tom had spent his career fixing impossible problems with inadequate resources, and the USS Remora was about to become the most important repair job of his life. He activated the torpedo tube compressed air system and pointed the tubes toward the most likely approach routes. The system couldn't fire actual weapons, but it could deliver a blast of high-pressure water that would knock anyone off their feet and buy him precious time. Agent Chen's voice came over the submarine's external speakers. She'd found the shipyard's public address system. "Mr. Reyes, you have 30 seconds to exit the submarine voluntarily. After that, we'll be forced to use methods that may result in damage to the vessel and risk to your personal safety." Tom looked at Captain Morrison's photograph, where the naval officer posed proudly next to stolen Nazi treasure. Morrison had trusted the wrong people and paid with his life. Tom wasn't going to make the same mistake. "Agent Chen," he called back through the submarine's external speakers, "you have 8 hours to consider the full implications of your situation. After that, the whole world knows what you did." Tom settled into the captain's chair and prepared for the longest night of his life. Outside, the CIA's most dangerous operatives were planning an assault on his submarine. But inside the USS Remora, an unemployed mechanic from Massachusetts was about to prove that some secrets are too important to stay buried, no matter who wants them to remain hidden. The assault began at 11:47 p.m. with a coordinated attack on 3 access points simultaneously. Tom watched through the periscope as Chen's tactical team moved with military precision, 2 men approaching the main conning tower hatch, 2 more heading for the emergency escape trunk, and Hawthorne himself leading an approach to the forward torpedo room access. Tom had anticipated this strategy. He waited until all 3 teams were committed to their approaches before activating his first defensive measure. The submarine's ballast alarm system, connected to powerful speakers throughout the vessel, suddenly blared at maximum volume. The sound was designed to alert submarine crews to emergency flooding conditions, and at close range it was physically disorienting. Tom watched through the periscope as the attackers stumbled, covering their ears against the assault of sound. He used their momentary confusion to activate the compressed air system. High-pressure water blasted from the forward torpedo tubes, catching Hawthorne's team off guard and knocking 2 men off the submarine's deck into the shallow water below. The force of the water jets was powerful enough to dent the shipyard's concrete seawall. But the CIA team regrouped quickly. Within minutes, they'd cut the submarine's electrical connection to the shipyard grid, plunging the Remora into darkness. Tom switched to emergency battery power, which gave him limited lighting and communications, but wouldn't last more than a few hours. Chen's voice came through the submarine's hull, muffled but audible. "Mr. Reyes, we're prepared to use cutting torches to access the submarine. This is your final warning to exit voluntarily." Tom moved through the submarine's narrow passages, using his intimate knowledge of the layout, reaching the forward compartment where he'd hidden his most important insurance policy. Earlier that afternoon, he'd rigged a dead man's switch connected to a small explosive charge, not enough to seriously damage the submarine, but sufficient to destroy Captain Morrison's original logbook and photographs if Tom was killed or captured. The detonator switch was crude but effective, built from components Tom had salvaged from the shipyard's demolition equipment. As long as he pressed a button every 15 minutes, the system remained inactive. If he failed to reset it because he was unconscious, captured, or dead, the charge would destroy the physical evidence that corroborated Elena's story. Tom activated his phone and sent a text message to Elena. "Under attack. Dead man switch active. If you don't hear from me every 15 minutes, assume evidence destroyed and proceed accordingly." Her response came back immediately. "Tom, get out of there. Story will run with or without physical evidence." Tom looked around the submarine's torpedo room, where Morrison's crew had loaded stolen Nazi treasure 40 years ago. The physical evidence was more than just corroboration. It was proof that the CIA's crimes were real, not just allegations that could be dismissed as conspiracy theories. The sound of cutting torches began echoing through the submarine's hull. Chen's team was methodically cutting through the main hatch, creating an entry point large enough for their assault. Tom estimated he had maybe 10 minutes before they breached the submarine's interior. He made his way to the submarine's engine room, where he'd prepared his final defensive position. The narrow passages and multiple compartments would force attackers to come at him one at a time, negating their numerical advantage. More importantly, the engine room contained the submarine's ballast control systems. Tom began flooding the aft ballast tanks, causing the submarine's stern to settle deeper into the harbor. The remora was now sitting at a steep angle, with its bow pointing toward the sky and water beginning to slosh through the lower compartments. The attackers would have to fight uphill through partially flooded passages, while Tom defended from elevated positions. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Agent Chen. "Mr. Reyes, flooding the submarine will not prevent us from reaching you. It will only ensure that you drown when we're forced to use more aggressive entry methods." Agent Chen, in about 6 hours, the Washington Post is going to publish a story that destroys your career and probably sends several of your colleagues to federal prison. Your best option is to withdraw and hope your CIA superiors decide you're worth protecting. Mr. Reyes, you're operating under several misconceptions about the situation. First, major newspapers don't publish unverified allegations about intelligence operations without extensive fact-checking and legal review. Second, even if such a story were published, it would be dismissed as conspiracy theory without physical evidence to support it. Tom looked at the detonator switch in his hand. "What makes you think I don't have physical evidence?" "Because we've been monitoring Dr. Vasquez's communications since she first contacted you. We know she sent digital copies of documents to Washington, but digital files can be dismissed as fabrications. Physical evidence, original documents, photographs, personal effects is much more difficult to dispute." Tom felt his stomach drop. They'd been watching Elena from the beginning, which meant they knew about her research and her contacts at the Washington Post. Worse, it meant they'd allowed the story to proceed because they believed they could discredit it without original physical evidence. "Agent Chen, even if you destroy the evidence aboard this submarine, there are still records. Records that will be classified or dismissed as forgeries once we demonstrate that no physical evidence exists to support them. Mr. Reyes, conspiracy theories about government cover-ups are published regularly. Without irrefutable proof, they're forgotten within days." The sound of cutting torches grew louder, indicating that Chen's team was nearly through the main hatch. Tom pressed the button on his detonator switch, resetting the 15-minute timer. If they captured him, at least the evidence would be destroyed rather than falling into CIA hands to be buried forever. "Mr. Reyes, I'm going to make you one final offer. Surrender now. Turn over all physical evidence, and we'll arrange for your death to appear accidental but painless. Continue resisting, and we'll be forced to make your death look like the result of a tragic accident involving unsafe conditions aboard a decommissioned submarine." Tom realized that Chen had never intended to let him live. The CIA had killed Morrison to protect Operation Depth Charge, and they would kill anyone else who threatened their secret. The only question was whether Tom's death would serve their purposes or his own. Through the submarine's hull, he could hear voices coordinating the final assault. Within minutes, they would breach the interior and begin their methodical advance through the flooded compartments. Tom had maybe one chance to turn the situation in his favor. He activated the submarine's emergency distress beacon, broadcasting on frequencies monitored by the Coast Guard and Harbor Patrol. The signal would bring official responders to the shipyard, forcing Chen's team to either withdraw or explain their presence to legitimate law enforcement. But Chen anticipated that move. Tom's phone rang immediately. "Mr. Reyes, the Coast Guard has been notified that a training exercise is in progress involving federal agents and a decommissioned submarine. They've been advised to maintain a safe distance from the area." Tom looked around the engine room, calculating his remaining options. The physical evidence was protected by the dead man's switch. The digital evidence was already with the Washington Post. His only remaining task was to survive long enough for the story to be published. The main hatch gave way with a grinding shriek of metal. Tom could hear boots on the submarine's deck plates as Chen's team prepared to enter the flooded interior. Within minutes, they would begin their advance through the narrow passages toward his position. Tom pressed the detonator button again and settled behind the engine room's main control panel. He'd done everything he could to protect the evidence and expose the truth. Now all he could do was make Chen's team work for their victory and hope that 8 hours would be enough time for justice to finally reach Operation Depth Charge. The first tactical team member appeared in the engine room doorway at 12:23 a.m., moving cautiously through knee-deep water with night vision equipment and what looked like a tranquilizer weapon. Tom waited until the man committed to entering the compartment before triggering his final surprise. The submarine's fire suppression system activated with explosive force, flooding the engine room with foam designed to smother electrical fires. The tactical officer stumbled blindly as white foam filled the air, his night vision equipment useless in the chemical cloud. Tom used the confusion to move to a new position behind the ballast control panel. But Hawthorne's voice came from the passage outside, coordinating his team with military precision. Gas masks, switch to thermal imaging. Target is using industrial systems for defense. Approach from forward and aft simultaneously. Tom realized he was facing professionals who'd dealt with defensive tactics before. The foam had bought him maybe 5 minutes, but they were adapting faster than he'd hoped. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "Tom, something's wrong. Post editor says story is being held pending fact-check of source materials." Tom's heart sank. Chen had been telling the truth about the CIA's ability to suppress the story without physical evidence. Digital files could be dismissed as forgeries, and newspapers wouldn't publish unverified allegations against intelligence agencies. Tom pressed the detonator button and typed back, "Physical evidence still secure. Keep pushing." Hawthorne appeared in the engine room, moving through the dissipating foam with professional confidence. His weapon was definitely non-lethal. They still needed Tom alive long enough to extract information about where he'd hidden the evidence. "Mr. Reyes, you've fought better than I expected, but this ends now." Tom had one advantage left: his intimate knowledge of the submarine's systems. While Hawthorne approached from the main entrance, Tom activated the ballast pumps again, suddenly flooding the engine room with another foot of harbor water. Hawthorne stumbled as the water level rose around his knees, and Tom used that moment to slip through a maintenance access panel into the submarine's auxiliary machinery space. The crawlway was barely large enough for Tom's shoulders, but it connected the engine room to the torpedo compartment through spaces too narrow for tactical teams to follow easily. Tom made his way forward through the submarine's mechanical systems, emerging near the forward torpedo tubes where he'd hidden Morrison's original confession video. Captain Morrison's final testament was a recording the captain had made shortly before his death, describing Operation Depth Charge and naming the CIA officials who'd organized it. Tom had found the video cassette hidden in the torpedo loading mechanism, sealed in a waterproof container that Morrison had concealed as his insurance against the same fate that eventually claimed him. Tom activated his phone's camera and began broadcasting live on social media, showing Morrison's video playing on a small screen he'd rigged in the torpedo room. The confession was devastating. Morrison identified specific CIA officials, described the theft in detail, and provided names and dates that could be verified through official records. "This is Captain James Morrison, commanding officer of USS Remora, recording this statement on April 15, 1987. Morrison's voice echoed through the flooded submarine. "I want to document my involvement in Operation Depth Charge and the CIA officials who organized unauthorized recovery of materials from German submarine U-461. Tom's live broadcast was being watched by dozens of people within minutes, the audience growing rapidly as viewers shared the stream. Elena's voice came through his phone. She was watching the broadcast from Washington. "Tom, that's it. Morrison's confession corroborates everything in our research. Even if they destroy the physical evidence, the live broadcast creates a permanent record." But Hawthorne had reached the torpedo room, moving through the flooded compartments with grim determination. His weapon was raised, no longer concerned with taking Tom alive now that the evidence was being broadcast publicly. "Mr. Reyes, you've just signed your own death warrant, and Dr. Vasquez's." Tom looked at the detonator switch, realizing that his 15-minute timer had elapsed during his movement through the submarine. The explosive charge should have detonated automatically, but his improvised dead man's switch had apparently malfunctioned in the flooding. Hawthorne smiled as he realized Tom's situation. "Your insurance policy failed, Mr. Reyes. Now we recover the physical evidence and eliminate anyone who's seen it." But Tom had learned something important during his 25 years of fixing broken mechanical systems. When one solution fails, you improvise another one. He grabbed the waterproof container holding Morrison's confession tape and smashed it against the torpedo tube, destroying the original recording even as it continued playing on his live broadcast. Then he activated the submarine's emergency blow system, forcing compressed air through all ballast tanks simultaneously. The USS Remora lurched violently as thousands of gallons of water were expelled from its ballast chambers. The submarine rose toward the surface of the harbor, shifting its angle dramatically as it broke free from the steel cradles that had supported it for decades. Hawthorne was thrown against the torpedo room bulkhead as the submarine moved, his weapon flying into the flooding water. Tom used the chaos to reach the main torpedo tube controls, where he'd rigged one final surprise. The torpedo tube wasn't loaded with a weapon. It contained every piece of physical evidence Tom and Elena had discovered, sealed in waterproof containers and connected to a simple mechanical ejection system. When Tom pulled the firing lever, compressed air launched the evidence containers out of the submarine and into the harbor, where they would float to the surface beyond reach of Chen's team. "Tom, the harbor patrol is responding to your emergency beacon." Elena's voice came through his phone. "Official boats are approaching the shipyard." Through the torpedo room's small porthole, Tom could see flashing lights approaching across the harbor. The Coast Guard and local police were responding to the submarine's distress signal, bringing official witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or intimidated by CIA threats. Hawthorne struggled to his feet in the flooding compartment, looking around the torpedo room with growing frustration. The physical evidence was gone, launched into the harbor, where it would be recovered by legitimate authorities. Morrison's confession was broadcasting live to hundreds of viewers, and official responders were arriving to document whatever they found aboard the submarine. "This isn't over," Hawthorne said, as he began retreating through the flooded passages. Tom pressed the detonator button one final time, but instead of destroying evidence, he activated the submarine's external lighting system. The USS Remora blazed with light in the darkness, clearly visible to every approaching rescue vessel and marking the location where one of the biggest intelligence scandals in American history had finally been exposed. Elena's voice came through his phone with the news he'd been waiting for. "Tom, the Washington Post just moved the story to immediate publication. Front page, online edition goes live in 30 minutes. Tom looked around the torpedo room, where it had all started, flooded now with harbor water, but finally free of the secrets that had been hidden there for 40 years. Morrison's confession was broadcasting to the world. The physical evidence was floating in the harbor under official protection, and the story that the CIA had killed to suppress was about to be published by one of America's most respected newspapers. Operation Depth Charge was finally over, and this time, the truth had won. 6 months later, Tom stood in the sunlight streaming through the windows of the USS Remora Museum, watching visitors study the exhibit he'd helped create. The submarine had been restored and converted into a memorial dedicated to exposing government corruption and honoring the victims of Operation Depth Charge. The bronze plaque near the museum entrance told the story simply, "In memory of Captain James Morrison, USN, and all those who paid the price for speaking truth to power." Donated by Thomas Reyes, who proved that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unlikely places. The Washington Post story had triggered the biggest intelligence scandal since Watergate. Congressional hearings had exposed decades of unauthorized CIA operations funded by stolen Nazi treasure. Rex Hawthorne was serving 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy and attempted murder. Agent Sarah Chen had disappeared entirely, her CIA employment records mysteriously classified beyond reach of congressional investigators. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. Elena approached from across the museum's main exhibit hall, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had finally received recognition. The community college had not only reinstated her, but promoted her to head the new Department of Intelligence History Studies, funded by a grant from families of Holocaust victims whose stolen property had finally been identified and returned. The Rosenberg family's attorney called this morning, Elena said, handing Tom his coffee. They recovered another painting from the evidence containers, a Degas that was stolen from their grandfather's gallery in Berlin in 1943. Tom nodded, still amazed by the impact their investigation had created. The physical evidence recovered from the harbor had led to the identification and return of nearly $50 million in stolen art and cultural artifacts. Museums around the world were updating their records, and families who'd given up hope of ever recovering their heritage were being reunited with pieces of their history. "Any word on the final settlement amount?" Tom asked. Elena smiled. $87 million to be distributed among verified victims and their families. The federal court ruled that the CIA's theft constituted a crime against humanity, which means there's no statute of limitations. Tom walked to the museum's main exhibit, which displayed Captain Morrison's confession video alongside photographs and documents that told the complete story of Operation Depth Charge. Visitors could listen to Morrison's voice describing the theft, see the original charts mapping the German U-boat's location, and read the correspondence between CIA officials who'd organized the cover-up. Danny joined them at the exhibit, looking considerably more relaxed than he had during those terrifying days when federal agents had been threatening his brother's life. "Tom, the bank's board approved the museum's expansion loan this morning. You'll be able to add the second submarine hall by next spring." The USS Remora Museum had become an unexpected tourist attraction, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to see where one of the biggest government conspiracies in history had been exposed. The revenue supported not just the museum operations, but a foundation that helped whistleblowers and researchers investigate government corruption. But the success brought its own complications. Tom had received offers to sell his story to movie producers, book publishers, and documentary filmmakers. The amounts were substantial enough to make him financially secure for life, but he'd turned them all down. Some stories were too important to be turned into entertainment. Sarah Martinez appeared in the museum's entrance, looking uncertain but determined. Tom hadn't spoken to her since before buying the submarine, but he'd heard through mutual friends that she'd been following the story and regretting her decision to distance herself during his difficult period. "Tom, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to congratulate you on everything you've accomplished." Tom studied her face, noting the genuine respect in her expression. Sarah had been right to be concerned about his financial stability and future prospects. She couldn't have predicted that his desperate gamble would lead to exposing one of the biggest scandals in American intelligence history. "Sarah, it's good to see you. Are you still working at the insurance company?" "Actually, I'm starting law school in the fall, specializing in government accountability and whistleblower protection. Your story inspired me to think about work that serves a larger purpose." Elena watched their interaction with the amused expression of someone who'd seen her share of personal dramas play out in academic settings. Tom appreciated her discretion in not interfering with what was clearly a private conversation. "Tom," Sarah continued, "I owe you an apology. When you bought that submarine, I thought you'd lost your mind. I didn't understand that you were following the same instincts that made you such a good mechanic, seeing potential in things other people had written off as worthless. Tom looked around the museum, where families were reading about their recovered heritage and students were learning about the importance of government oversight. Sarah, you weren't wrong to be concerned. I had lost my mind, in a way. I'd lost the ability to see past my immediate problems to the larger possibilities. And now? Tom gestured toward the Submarine exhibit, where Morrison's confession was playing for a group of high school students. Now, I understand what my father meant about everything having a purpose. My purpose wasn't just to fix broken things, it was to fix broken systems. Elena approached with a folder of papers, her expression businesslike but warm. Tom, the Holocaust Memorial Foundation wants to commission a second exhibit focusing on art recovery efforts. The funding would support museum operations for the next 5 years. Tom looked at the proposal, noting that it would establish the USS Remora Museum as a permanent center for research into government accountability and historical justice. The money would ensure that Morrison's story continued reaching new audiences and that future researchers had resources to investigate other buried scandals. What do you think? Tom asked Elena. I think Captain Morrison would approve. His confession helped recover stolen property and exposed corruption. But more importantly, it established that individual conscience can triumph over institutional power. Tom signed the foundation agreement, officially committing to expanding the museum's mission beyond just Operation Depth Charge. The USS Remora would become a symbol of the principle that truth matters more than convenience, and that ordinary people have both the power and responsibility to hold their government accountable. As afternoon faded into evening, Tom walked through the submarine one final time, checking the exhibits and ensuring that Morrison's story would be preserved for future generations. The torpedo room where he'd made his final stand had been converted into a reflection space, with comfortable seating and Morrison's confession playing on continuous loop. But the real memorial wasn't in the museum displays or the bronze plaques. It was in the knowledge that justice had finally been served, that stolen property had been returned to its rightful owners, and that government officials who'd committed crimes in the name of national security had been held accountable for their actions. Tom settled into the captain's chair in the submarine's control room, looking out through the periscope at the harbor where his adventure had begun. Millfield Harbor was thriving again, with tourists and researchers bringing new life to a community that had been forgotten by economic progress. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Everything has a purpose, mijo. Sometimes you just have to look deeper to find it. Tom had looked deeper than anyone expected and found not just treasure, but truth. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The unemployed mechanic who'd been ridiculed for buying a rusted submarine had become the curator of one of the most important historical sites in New England, dedicated to ensuring that some secrets remain buried only until someone brave enough comes along to dig them up. The USS Remora Museum would continue operating for decades to come, teaching visitors that the most important discoveries often come from the most unlikely places and that ordinary people with extraordinary determination can change the course of history. Tom Reyes had found his purpose at last, and it was exactly what his father had always told him it would be. Fixing things that others had given up on, including the very idea that justice was still possible in a world where power too often mattered more than truth.